In the ancient world, when a city fell, the war was far from over. It had only just begun for the women left behind. They were more than collateral damage. They became living, breathing symbols of a city's defeat. Their suffering was no accidental byproduct of war, but a planned, deliberate act of cruelty meant to break not just their bodies, but to annihilate their very identities. This is not a tale in heroic myths or grand histories. It is a hidden chapter of humiliation, where the cruelest punishments were reserved not for soldiers but for the wives, daughters, and mothers of the conquered. These women were dragged into slavery, beaten, and paraded as the spoils of war. Their dignity became the final, most satisfying prize for the victors. Punishment was never confined to a dark prison cell. It became a public spectacle intended to crush the spirit as thoroughly as the body. The goal was always to leave a scar that no physical wound could match. Sometimes the most brutal punishments were delivered not with a sword but with a simple object from a market stall. Enter the radish and the fig, common foods turned into grotesque instruments of torture. These simple items were used not only to inflict pain but to mock the accused woman, making a spectacle of her supposed shame. The punishment transformed everyday groceries into tools of intimate, unbearable public degradation. The accused woman would be stripped from the waist down, her hands pinned so she could not hide herself, as the crowd's gaze fixed on her. A magistrate or an angry husband would announce her supposed crime, adultery, seduction, or some breach of honor. And then, with slow deliberation, the humiliating act would begin. This was no medical procedure or execution. It was a symbolic violation, a grotesque reversal of roles. A hard, knobbly radish might be pressed against her body, bruising and scraping her flesh. A dried fig, when forced inside, could tear her skin and cause a hot, burning abrasion. Yet even this agony was temporary compared to the deeper wound inflicted by the act, the knowledge that her body had been turned into a stage prop for the crowd's contempt. In some cases, the object was left in place or even paraded around and smashed to amplify the humiliation. A common food item, something she might have eaten that very morning, became a symbol of her permanent dishonor. Her once pure body was now publicly marked, spoiled, and contaminated for life. The aftermath was devastating. In an age without antiseptics, those raw injuries often became infected, leading to chronic pain and lasting scars. Socially, the act obliterated a woman's privacy and dignity. The woman who walked into the agora, marketplace, as a wife or neighbor left as a public spectacle. Her family was shamed, and her children's futures were altered forever. In Athens, where reputation and civic standing were the only true currency, this kind of bodily degradation became an instrument of social death. If these crimes of the body were horrifying, the most public and brutal punishment of all was called bodizo, the agony of public exposure. This punishment did not take place in a dark cell, but in the roaring heart of the city, the Athenian agora. Instead of seclusion, shame was inflicted in the busiest marketplace, among merchants, philosophers, and ordinary citizens. To be dragged here not as a free woman, but as an object of ridicule was the ultimate degradation. Bound upright to a post in the blazing sun, the condemned woman was stripped bare, sometimes completely, sometimes left with only a ragged cloth barely covering her. In a society obsessed with female modesty, such exposure was even more devastating than the cruelest beating. This was not mere exposure. It was a calculated display designed to maximize her humiliation. As she stood there, neighbors, traders, and even slaves would pass by, seeing her not as a person, but as a living cautionary tale. Children would laugh. Old men would point. Some would even spit or hurl insults. The guards did nothing to intervene because bodizo thrived on the crowd's participation. Meanwhile, the physical torment continued unabated. Hours under the sun burned her skin until it blistered. Without water, her mouth dried up in choking thirst. Hunger gnawed at her stomach, and weakness spread through her limbs, forcing her into shameful, trembling postures she could not control. Dust from the marketplace clung to her sweat, caking her body in a final layer of filth. Insects gathered, crawling freely over her wounds, her eyes, and even into her mouth. The longer she remained, the more grotesque the spectacle became. A woman who had once been respected, perhaps a citizen's wife, was reduced to nothing more than a public warning. Passers-by would whisper to each other, "This is what happens when you dishonor the polis, your husband, or your gods." But the deepest wound from Bodiso was never physical. It was the erasure of her dignity. In Athens, a woman's value was tied to her modesty and her household reputation. Exposure destroyed both body and honor at once. The humiliation was worse than any beating, because its marks were invisible. A shame that followed her home, whispers that poisoned her family's reputation, and a stigma that would never fade. Some women endured this torment for hours, others for a full day. A few never returned alive, collapsing from heat stroke or simply left to die. Athenians considered the punishment complete only when the humiliation had run its course, and the example was seared into the public memory. Bodiso was never meant to punish the body. It was crafted to destroy the spirit and to turn a woman's very flesh into a public message. You do not belong to yourself. You belong to the city, and the city may strip you bare at will. If public exposure was nearly the worst shame, there was one punishment even more soul-crushing: the removal of her identity itself. In ancient Greece, a woman's hair was more than just a part of her appearance. It was a symbol of her pride, identity, and femininity. To shave it away was to strip away her honor. This is why head shaving, often combined with brutal beatings, was one of the most humiliating punishments imaginable. For a wife accused of adultery or a woman defying her guardian's authority, this punishment was designed not only to inflict pain but to shame her for life. Her hair would be cut off in public, leaving her bare and exposed. In a society where long hair signified beauty and virtue, a shaved head marked her as permanently disgraced, a stigma that followed her every glance from her neighbors. But humiliation alone was not enough. Beatings were added to deepen the suffering. Struck with rods, belts, or fists, her body was covered in bruises while her scalp carried the public mark of dishonor. For enslaved women, this combination was especially common. A master might shave a slave woman's head to distinguish her from free women, using violence to reinforce total submission. The cruelty of this punishment lay in its permanence. A physical wound might heal, but hair could take months or even years to grow back, if it ever did, to its former length. During that time, she could not hide her disgrace. Every time she stepped into public, her bare scalp announced her shame louder than words. In ancient Greece, to lose one's hair as punishment was to lose one's identity. Together with the bruises from a beating, it became a constant, brutal reminder that a woman's body did not belong to her, but to her husband, her master, or the state. They could take from her not only her dignity but the very symbols of her womanhood, leaving her with nothing but the lasting, visible scar of their cruelty.